Tado Cantwell with €10 says, welcome back. Ireland has vaccinated many 12 to 18-year-olds. Will be an interesting comparison with UK schools and potential shutdowns. And Simon Dwayne tweets on the hashtag, have you lost sight of the fact that over 100 people are dying per day? And that number is doubling every 6 weeks. Don't let this level of deaths be normalized. Now, I'm taking that as a challenge to myself. I suppose in response, what I would say is that, we can't shut down society because people are dying. There will always be transmissible illnesses that kill people, right? So we've often had winters where tens of thousands of people die from flu, and that doesn't mean that we stop sending kids to school. There are real costs to lockdown. There are real costs to keeping children out of school. And I actually think there are real risks and downsides for some of the mitigations that people are supporting in schools. For example, bubbles. I think the idea that we are constantly, often in a well-intentioned way and often in a necessary way, forcing kids to live in a world where they have to constantly be worried, are they transmitting a virus to each other? I think that, I think there are real downsides to that. So I think we do need to have a balance here. Where I think probably everyone can agree is that there are measures we can take which don't have those downsides and which we can probably continue having forever, and it will limit COVID deaths and limit other unnecessary deaths, for example, from flu, which is, let's have good ventilation, let's have proper sick pay. But I think now that we have the vast majority of the population vaccinated, which means that for most people this is a relatively mild disease, we can't have the same kind of authoritarian, and I backed all of these authoritarian policies before the vaccines. I think they're absolutely necessary. I'm not saying this to disparage them, but I'm saying that now the vaccines are around, we do have to start, letting kids live their normal lives, essentially. Aaron, I know you want to come in on this particular point.
Yeah, so I mean, look, we were in Malta celebrating my wedding, Michael. And there were a number of sort of points raised on social media about this, some completely deranged, which didn't make any sense, but some were important. And one of the more important ones, thoughtful ones, is, well, you're talking about COVID-19 and you're going abroad. Well, firstly, tourism is huge, whether it's inside the UK, whether it's abroad. And this is hugely interesting for me. Nobody so far went to that wedding from the UK with COVID, without COVID, and caught it there. 2 people who were invited got COVID. 1 person got it in the UK. On the second day they were in Malta, they took a test, tested positive, they isolated. Another friend of mine, very old school friend of mine, got it before he went out and had the symptoms, tested positive, never went out. And everybody I know, and we're talking about a wedding party of about 120 people, nobody got it in Malta. Very low case numbers there. Now, if you're going to Malta with 2 vaccinations, you're having a test there 3 days before you come back here. You're having a test here on the second day. It's incredibly hard, I think. That's just my personal view, but the data confirms that. It's very hard, particularly in summer, for that to be an issue. And actually, going to watch football in a pub a couple of months earlier for the European Championships final was a more dangerous thing than going to a foreign country. As strange as that sounds, it's true. Equally, nightclubs, pubs, bars, we can talk about whether it's a COVID passport, whether it's I think you probably want a mix of a passport with, a recent test showing negative, obviously. But there are ways, Michael, I agree with you. You can navigate this and say, yeah, that works. It's not perfect. We'll have cases. People will pass away. But you can manage it in such a way that you minimize risks. And yes, we carry on life relatively normally. With this, I don't think that's the same thing, because I don't think we're mitigating the risks in schools, Michael. I don't think there's a plan. I don't think they're taking appropriate steps. With travel, you've got this huge infrastructure now that's put in place. People have to jump through a whole bunch of regulatory hurdles. Good, brilliant. That should be there. And we're going to see the same, I think, as bars and clubs, sort of hopefully stay open during winter. But with schools, I don't see it, Michael. And I think it's dangerous when you put those 2 things in the same category. This is dangerous behavior, yet we're making modifications, behavioral, built environment. And this is also dangerous, but we're not doing anything. I think the latter category is a really concerning one. And using the former as saying, well, we shouldn't worry about this because we're making plans here. Well, great, we're making plans there. But when it comes to schools, Michael, You've got unvaccinated kids. You've not really changed the built environment whatsoever. We haven't really run this experiment. Well, we have actually. We ran the experiment with the Delta variant in last winter, and look what happened. It does feel like, again, like I say, we could be blindsided by another crisis this winter. Do I think it will lead to a mass lockdown? No, I don't, because 62% of the whole population is vaccinated. But I think it could be a bigger crisis than we probably think right now, and it could have been averted. Again, like I say, what are the contingency plans? You could say we're going to have an 8-week Christmas holiday or a 6-week Christmas holiday. We're going to have double the length of half terms, 4-day weeks. Hybrid learning, maybe 2 days a week. You could do all of these things. They're not in the conversation because we have a government pathologically addicted to saying we're returning to normal. Well, every time they've done that so far in this crisis, Michael, it's failed. And I'm not saying this from the perspective of I want us all to stick in our homes again. Last winter was the worst winter of my life. I absolutely don't want to see a repeat of that. But at the same time, I think it's entirely fair to expect Secretary of State for Education and the government to be able to keep kids safe. And I don't think they're doing that.
I suppose I just think a lot of the things you're proposing there are actually really big deals. So the reason I'm putting forward ventilation as something which we can all agree is a good idea is because it won't get rid of COVID. It will limit the spread of it as well as the spread of flu, etc., without really affecting kids' development and education. The idea of just making Christmas 6 to 8 weeks long or making the day 4 days a week, I think all of these things would have really real costs. And now that we are in a situation where most people are vaccinated, I don't think that 100 people dying a day.
Most kids aren't vaccinated.
No, but most people who are at risk of dying from COVID are vaccinated, right? So the idea that we can...
We're talking about disruption. But we're talking about disruption to education. So if we have swathes of the population, 4 to 16 getting COVID, that's going to disrupt their education as well.
Well, it's not.
The question is, what's the best way to...
But it's not necessary. The point I'm making is, kids getting COVID isn't necessarily going to disrupt their education that much because we don't have self-isolation anymore. We don't have bubbles. So it will be a bit more like getting a cold, getting the flu. And, for kids and for vaccinated people, it's not that different from getting the flu. Yes, you can have long COVID. You can also get post-viral fatigue syndrome, which many people do get from other viruses. So I'm saying we do need to have ways to try and limit the spread of it, but we're not going to get to zero COVID. And when we are we are balancing the costs and the benefits of certain policies, I think taking kids out of school is a really big deal. And I think now
nobody's saying
well, you are. If you're saying you want to have a Christmas holiday that's 6 to 8 weeks long, I'm not saying it's a hard. I'm not school for a really long time.
I'm not. Well, presently it's how long is Christmas holiday? It's what, 2 weeks?
2 weeks.
Okay, so 4 weeks. Yeah. So I'm saying, what are there contingency plans that affect, Michael? If you do get huge case numbers, we're not talking about it. Before we had the end of lockdown, we were having the conversation. Thank God, all the projections were really wrong about 100,000 new cases a day, and people would say, "Well, what do we do if that happens?" And it felt like, yes, the government wasn't going far enough, but there were certain preparations in place. What are the preparations in place if this runs right throughout the whole school population? And the only thing when I'm talking about this, again, if people are sort of just tuning in now, Aaron's being incredibly pessimistic. Generally, I'm not pessimistic about the situation at all. But I think we're looking at Delta now, kills 3 people this time last year, kills 120 people today. I'm not talking about deaths. I'm talking about the fact it's a fundamentally different virus, the one that people generally think we're dealing with. It seems like a giant experiment. It does seem like a giant experiment. And I agree with you, Michael. I also want to minimize the disruption to kids' education. My point is, if X, Y, Z happens, what is the government going to do about it? We haven't really heard anything.
Yeah, I mean, I think they should have more plans. But I suppose the question is 100 people dying a day enough to say, let's make the Christmas holiday 8 weeks long? I'm saying no.
I'm not talking about deaths. It's a straw man. I'm not talking about deaths. I'm not talking about deaths. I'm talking about the disruption to kids. You're saying, well, we have to minimize disruption to children's education. Well, if basically the entire population, 4 to 16, gets COVID, I think that's going to be pretty damn disruptive, Michael. And so what steps can we do to mitigate that?
Well, that's going to happen whether or not you make Christmas holidays longer.
Is it?
Yeah, I mean, I don't see why lengthening the Christmas holiday is going to stop people getting COVID.
They're going to get vaccinated. No, because no, Michael, that's not true. They're going to get vaccinated. We know that they're all probably that entire population will be vaccinated by next spring. So I think that's quite a sort of fatalistic and dangerous position to have. They're all going to get it. Really? I mean, I don't think that's true at all. Anyway.
Well, I mean, I think probably we will all get it. I mean, but ideally you'd get it after you get vaccinated. Yeah. But for kids, the risk, even if you're not vaccinated, the risk is very, very low. Because I think the risk of taking them out of education for another significant amount of time between now and spring
2
is
weeks.
probably
Why
bigger.
vaccinate?
Well,
Michael, why vaccinate them then? Why vaccinate them then?
Because vaccinating them doesn't take them out of school. I'm saying
why vaccinate them? You're saying they're gonna get it anyway. It doesn't really matter. It doesn't really change anything. Why vaccinate them?
Well, I'm saying
why vaccinate them all after they've got it?
So the issue is weighing up costs.
Use those jabs for older people.
Right. The issue is costs and benefits. So I'm saying it's probably worth vaccinating kids to stop them getting COVID before being vaccinated, because vaccinating them isn't going to really affect their
development. It's worth vaccinating them after they've had it.
No, it's worth. Well, it is worth vaccinating them after they've had it. Actually, yeah, because it will still increase their resistance to getting it again. Ideally, you'd vaccinate them beforehand. Yeah. Ideally, you'd vaccinate them beforehand. But I don't think taking them out of school until they're vaccinated is a particularly good idea.
You're attributing positions to me that I'm not saying.
The policies you're coming up with seem completely useless to me. A 4-week Christmas holiday, what's the point in that? A 4-day week, what's the point in that? These things are barely going to limit the spread of COVID-19.
Oh, no, I disagree.
Radically affect people's education.
No, I think, for instance, if we have a doubling, if we have exponential growth going into Christmas, I would be really happy for the government to say, well, look, if that happens, we're looking at plans where we would double the period of Christmas holidays and we'd accelerate, rollout of vaccines to young people. That to me sounds wise. Doesn't seem particularly radical. Maybe I'm crazy. I think that's a perfectly normal thing to be putting out there. I mean, we'll agree to disagree.
If we get that exponential growth, I mean, I think probably quite likely what we'll see is a similar thing that we saw in June and July, which is where we have a fairly constant level of high rates of COVID until we get to something a bit like herd immunity or we vaccinate a few more people. Someone says, why can't we just invest and improve online education for when people need to be out of school? I just don't see it happening. I've worked in a school. The point with kids getting into school is that why you need everyone there is because it is the kids who are most marginalized who are going to suffer the most if you're out of school. So however good you make YouTube videos or however good you make online education, you're going to have a lot of people who are fundamentally messed up for a while because they spent so long out of school.
We agree on that, Michael. We agree on that.
I want to go to a few more comments on the last topic of discussion because it's created a lot of interesting chat. One from Gavin Jackson. Sure thing, Michael. Teachers like myself just love being thrown under the bus rather than authoritarian. You mean necessary measures? I think I'd say at that point, and I actually links to someone else saying, wait, are we all going to get COVID? I think most of us are. We are. No, I mean, that's the point. With Delta, most of us are going to get COVID-19. And
ideally with a vaccine.
It's a question of sooner rather than later. Yeah, ideally, obviously. Yeah. I mean, I was really scared of getting COVID before I was double vaccinated. Now I'm double vaccinated. I just see it as it would be a minor inconvenience, right? I mean, I've been doing lots of things where I could have got COVID-19, right? And so I do think we are going to have to move into a headspace where we're not constantly dictating our lives and what we're willing to do and what we're happy to do based on whether or not we might catch COVID-19. Obviously, there are going to be people who are immunocompromised, who are going to be in situations where I think there are, genuine problems there. And also, I would absolutely say no teacher who is immunocompromised should be forced to go into school. I think we need to have much better health and safety laws. As I say, I also think schools should be much safer than they're currently being made, but I think that should be in a way which doesn't particularly limit kids' education, and also accepting that there is still going to be COVID around. We're not going to get to a zero COVID situation. Related to the we're not going to get to a zero COVID situation, there was another comment that I thought was interesting. Michael, fewer than 30 deaths in New Zealand. What was authoritarian here? Now, I was for the New Zealand strategy before we had widespread vaccinations, but what is authoritarian in New Zealand is you can't go in or out. Right. That's quite significant that you can't go in or out. And then any one time someone does come in with the Delta variant, you have to have local lockdowns. Now, those are authoritarian measures. I thought they were justified before the vaccine. I don't think they're justified after the vaccine, because this is now a much milder illness for people who are double vaccinated. So, yes, I think that what New Zealand is doing at the moment, I think they've had a much better 2 years than we have done. But I think ultimately New Zealand will transition to similar policies which we are having, which is to say we need to get as many people in this population vaccinated as possible. And then we need to go back to something which is quite a lot like normal. As I say, I'd like that to be a better normal. I'd like that to be a normal where we have good ventilation, where we have sick pay, where we have all of these things that will make us less vulnerable to other diseases and actually make our lives better as opposed to worse. But I don't want to have travel restrictions. I don't want to have to self-isolate for 10 days if I've been next to someone who has an illness that will only have a mild effect on me. So yeah, I think we're going to move to the next phase of COVID-19. I mean, I was saying on Twitter the other day, I was defending, I mean, we are going to have to learn to live with the virus. Someone suggested that maybe a better phrase is we're going to have to adapt to the virus. At the same time, I do think there is a sort of mental and emotional thing here, which is we are going to have to come to terms with the fact that this is a new virus which is circulating. It's going to be there forever. We're probably going to catch it. Obviously, this creates very difficult situations if you are someone for whom the vaccine didn't work, particularly well on, and that's why we need to have government policies which are massively supportive of people in those situations. But we're not going to stop the world. We're not going to stop travel. We're not going to have bubbles of kids spending 2 weeks here out of school, 2 weeks there. Normally you'd expect a kid to take 4 days off school in a year. Now we see it as normal for them to take 100 days off school in a year. Right, that's not good. Obviously, it was necessary before vaccines. Is it necessary now? I would say no. Aaron, I don't know if you want to respond to that.
No, I mean, my difference with you is I think I have no problem with kids taking an extra 2 weeks off if it means they get COVID with a vaccine rather than without a vaccine. I mean, that would be my position.
Well, I just don't think 2 weeks off school is. I mean, I don't. If that was the option, if it was 2 weeks off school to not get it before the vaccine, I'd go for that. But I think you're going to have a marginal benefit in 2 weeks of school, unless you just don't send them back to school, or you have this situation you had last time around where you have all these bubbles going home. I mean, I don't think that's going to make much of a difference. Basically,
I think it boils down with the school kids thing. I think it boils down to, I mean, you're right. We're all going to get it. Ideally, we get variants which are much weaker than the variants we have today, and ideally, we have much stronger vaccines than we have today, and that's highly likely if you get it in 2, 3, 4 years' time. But, I do think it's a bit concerning if we're saying, oh, yeah, kids can get COVID without being vaccinated. We haven't really said that about any other part of the population so far.
I mean, I agree with you. They are the part of the population that's least at risk from COVID. It's not an accident.
We're talking about 12. We're talking about 12 million people. I mean, you're still talking about hundreds of thousands of people who are very vulnerable. Hundreds of thousands.
Well, the vulnerable kids are getting the vaccines.
Well, I mean, how quickly? How quickly? If the schools open this week, Michael, then I mean, anyway.
Well, I mean, the rollout is happening now, right? It takes about a week for you to have some effect from it. So,
it takes 3 weeks. It takes 3 weeks to be optimal.
No, it takes 3 weeks to be optimal. It takes a week to have
and that's of 1 dose. There. Ideally, you'd have 2 doses anyway. But my point is, Mike, we agree that ultimately we have to get used to the idea that you're going to get it, but you're going to have to be vaccinated. My point is, ideally, we would be in a situation where that would also apply to school children. There's a bit of a double logic going on. But of course, their education shouldn't be disrupted. And I agree with you. We're going to have to get used to COVID. By the way, we're going to have to get used to pandemics. There's going to be, we're probably going to be able to adapt to COVID in the next 10 years, and there'll be something else. And going back to your point originally about New Zealand, I mean, that is when you want to be doing those sorts of things. If you have something as transmissible as COVID, but as deadly as Ebola, we are fucked. We are really in big trouble. And that's when you absolutely want the state to behave like New Zealand until you have a vaccine, of course. But I think you're right. You look at the cost benefit, you look at how deadly COVID is, you look at the fact we have a vaccine. Yes, I don't think you should be closing your borders. I don't think you should be having a huge clamping down on civil liberties like you see in Australia right now. There's something being trialed in Australia where the government effectively can find out where you are purely at random, geotag you, identify you. I think that's really concerning. I think that's really, really concerning. I think that's Chinese.
You have to take a picture of yourself in 15 minutes, I think.
Yeah, and I think that's Chinese style surveillance. And the whole point is, look, China doesn't pretend to be a democracy. You can criticize it on human rights, civil liberties, or you can say it's done a great job on poverty eradication, growing its green sector. Both can be true, but it doesn't say it's a democracy, right? It doesn't say we elevate the idea of individual freedom above other things. They don't say that. Countries like Australia do, but I think when you see things like that happening, clearly, that's at odds with their professed values. And I think that has to be, that is concerning. I'm not a libertarian. I believe that, yes, of course you can rationally curtail freedoms if it's going to save people's lives. Of course you can. We do it all the time. You do it in war. But I don't think the risks posed by COVID, if we're vaccinated, are sufficient to be clamping down to that extent, like we see in Australia. I think it's deeply worrying. And of course, the bigger concern is going back to my previous point about this being an age of pandemics because of climate change, by the way. Great book by Andres Malm on this about the corona crisis and the case for war communism. Sounds strange, but it's a good book, very short book, much recommended with Verso Books. We're going to have more of these. And I think, if there is a fourth and fifth and sixth coronavirus this century and they're more deadly, if this is how we're seeing states respond now, I think, it is something to be deeply worried about. And I'm not somebody who says we need to talk about liberty. I'm not one of these right-wing libertarian nut jobs, but it has to be a concern at the same time.
This is interesting. Thomas Smithhurst with 17.99. Thank you very much. Williamson could have had the entire curriculum rewritten and adapted to suit the current cohort. That is doable, rather than expecting to catch up to where they'd been had there been no pandemic at all. I think that's very interesting. I would support something along those lines. I think the issue is, and this is quite a mainstream thing to say now. This isn't a particularly radical thing to say. The catch up is less about will they know the algorithms and whatever in maths, and will they know certain bits of grammar in English. Is the fact that kids isolating at home has real consequences for them, and it has real consequences in terms of the development of kids and their emotional well-being, etc., etc. So it is, are we happy to have more of that when we are looking at an illness which is very comparable to other ones that we've lived with for a very long time? Obviously, before the vaccines, that was not the case. After the vaccines, it kind of is. Aaron, any final thoughts tonight?
The point about children and young people and mental health, I think it can't be overstated. I think many people watching this, they know a young person who before the pandemic was very different to the young person or the kid that came out the other side, whether it's anxiety, sleep problems, and that is a hugely important point. We can't have, it's not just about, yes, of course, the education, the sort of cognitive development, reading and numeracy skills aren't where they should be. Of course, that's all hugely important. But if you've got kids suffering from insomnia, anxiety, depression, that is a real consideration. It's a real consideration. So I agree with you, Michael. I think that has to be up there with if we're talking in a highly quantitative sense about, deaths and hospitalizations, we also need to be talking about people's physical and mental health, and particularly young people, because they have really missed out. They have really missed out. A 5-year-old child can't understand what's going on. They don't know why the world has changed the way that it has over the last 18 months. And I think that has to be a variable in terms of how we move forward now as a society. And I agree with you. There is no happy medium, because ultimately we're in a terrible situation with this. Better than a year ago, of course, but still not ideal. But like I say, I don't need to ruminate on this publicly. I think anybody who's got a child, or have their friends have kids, or that's a relative, a niece, a nephew of that age, I mean, it's really horrible to see. And I know a couple of young kids, they're different people now. They're different people, and I think that can't be taken for granted.
All right, let's wrap it up there. Thanks for all of your comments. The audience are very engaged today. We will be back on Monday. Aaron Bastani, it's been a pleasure speaking to you. Glad to have you back in the country.
Thank you, Michael. I'm glad as well. We often have this, Michael and Aaron, they hate each other, the disagreements. Not at all. Michael and I have the greatest respect for one another. You and I have the greatest respect for one another. But look, Novara doesn't have a party line. I think that's one of the strengths of the organization. We disagree about these things, and I'm sure our audience disagree with us, and often we learn from them. So long may it continue.
Absolutely, I wholeheartedly concur. Quite out of sync with the rest of the show. You've been watching Tysky Sour on Novara Media. Good night.